We are in the 4th week of PTR testing. They gave us 3 separate balance patches this week, finally bringing nerfs to all the overpowered specs. The dungeons rolled over back to the 4 War Within dungeons and Ecodome, with some minor changes, and they seem to be done with raid testing completely. On Monday, they surprised us with an unexpected balance patch that gutted Boomy and had changes to a few other classes. They then followed up with another patch on Thursday, which brought reasonable nerfs to the top performing specs like Frost DK and Hunter, and then the week was ended with a minor patch to healers. I will give a summary of the changes in the 3 patches collated into one. One very notable change is that they did end up backing up on the Mystic Touch change, which, as you know, I was very outspoken against. Now, in the past few weeks, we saw Boomies doing massive funnel bursts and even one-shotting bosses. This week, they massively nerfed the tier set to a degree where it kind of is not playable, and the Elun's Chosen tier set is also kind of bad. So Boomy is honestly looking like one of the lowest damage classes now, if not the lowest. Obviously, it still has Beam, Mark, and Druid utility as its saving grace, but the damage definitely isn't there after this. Frost DK did cop a flat 12% nerf. However, the limits of the spec have been pushed since last week and is definitely still looking like one of the top performers for dungeon overall and probably single target as well, even despite this nerf. BM Hunter was given a big nerf at the start of the week. 4 individual aspects of their damage copped a fairly reasonable reduction, bringing it from the absolute best spec to just simply being a strong spec. It was given another 3% later in the week, but I think the potential is still there. Marksmanship Hunter was given a 10% flat nerf. However, in the light of BM being nerfed, people are now discovering how strong MM was. In addition, they also gave a counter buff to Sentinel MM, and now everyone's playing Sentinel instead of Dark Ranger. Now, for all 3 mage specs, they took some power out of the tier sets, which were simming around 40% increases, and now they're closer to 20%. Fire Mage got a nerf to Frostfire at the start of the week, and then a further nerf to it again later. However, they did buff Pyroblast and Flamestrike by a massive 30%, which puts a lot of strength into the baseline. Fire Mage is definitely doing a lot of damage now. Arcane, on the other hand, pretty much just saw a nerf. The reduction in Harmony stacks really reduced their damage in big pools, so now their funnel profile is at a cost of overall damage. They still do what they did before in funnel situations though, so I think the spec is still very strong. And Frost Mage had a similar treatment, tier set nerfs and baseline buffs. It's definitely looking strong, but probably worse than other mage specs as normal. Ret got some massive buffs and bug fixes. The spec is no longer trash. Ret overalls are looking alright, but they aren't scratching the top specs like Frost DK or MM though, and because of Ret's poor profile, the damage I think is still not really there for Ret to excel at the high end. Shadow Priest saw a big 11% nerf, which was always going to happen. The single target is still looking good, probably going to be good on a lot of raid bosses still. The spec is definitely looking on the edge in Mythic Plus. I think the single target is there, and with the rise of Resto Druid, Shadow might still have a place in Mythic Plus. Now, they did buff all 3 rogue specs. Assassination saw a buff to all abilities, and the spec is definitely capable of doing damage now. Outlaw saw a 10% increase in single target, and seemingly a 10% reduction in AoE to compensate. However, because of the way Blade Flurry works, this buff also does increase AoE damage, and Sub got a reasonable buff to his AoE. Shaman's kinda got shafted this patch. Enhanced did get a 23% nerf in the splash damage of Tempest, which comes out to a loss of about 5 to 6% overall. My initial reaction is that this was crazy, but they also did nerf a lot of other specs, so I think Enhanced is still in a fine position in Mythic Plus. Very annoying that they still haven't shipped out a bug fix Totemic though, because it's still pretty much untestable. And Ellie pretty much got nothing. After getting a nerf to the Stormbringer tier last week, Ellie has been struggling super hard, and this week they buffed 2 talents in the Farseer tree, which really don't do much and add up to a 3.5% increase in raid only. The issues with Farseer Elemental Shaman extend far beyond the baseline spec, and more into how the 4-piece is merely a 0.8% increase, which is barely even worth equipping. All 3 Warlock specs got pretty massive buffs to their hero talents. Demonology is a clear winner with giant buffs to Diabolist, making it very strong in single target and almost competitive with the top specs on overall. Destruction got a big buff to Hellcaller, which makes it feel strong, especially on big AoE pools. And Affliction got big buffs to both trees, but the spec was kinda behind before, and I think it's still the worst Warlock spec. And Fury Warrior got a buff to Mountain Thane and to their base AoE that makes them viable if Battle Shout is good in a comp. However, the damage is still not really there, and they are still target capped. For changes to tanks, Brewmaster got a big buff to Harmonic Surge from Master of Harmony, which does do a lot of damage now, especially in single target. Prot Paladin got massive nerfs to Lightsmith, bringing them from the top DPS tank to close to the bottom. And Prot Warrior had some minor buffs and nerfs that leads to Mountain Thane being good. For changes to healers, Discipline did get an Oracle nerf. about 20% off shields, which may or may not impact the viability of Oracle, but Void Weaver did get a pretty big buff with 30% extra damage on Entropic Rift, which does do a lot of damage. Mistweaver got a spot healing buff with 80% on Vivify, but this also came with a nerf to Chi Harmony and later a blanket 5% nerf because of their strength and raid. And Preservoker got a change where their Temporal Anomaly actually brings a relevant shield in Mythic Plus. It only adds up to 8% of a DPS's health though. And a few other specs got minor buffs or nerfs that didn't really change their damage that much. Overall, this week had a lot more balancing than last week and a lot less specs went ignored. I did make a tier list this week, and of course, as with all tier lists, it's very early to go off of one and some parts of it are subjective. It is very roughly ordered, but some specs I haven't seen extensively tested, so they could be better than I placed them. I think MM and Frost Decay are definitely looking like the highest overall damage specs, while Mage is also up there while providing the Mage utility. The specs in A I think are doing competitive enough damage that they are candidates for a top comp. The specs in B I think are a bit behind on damage or utility compared to those specs but could still fit in. And the specs on C I think are very behind in damage and have also only received nerfs with no complementary buffs. For tanks, Brewmaster damage is definitely looking above the rest. However, if the top comp ends up having a DK and a Hunter, the control is definitely a concern, and I could see VDH maintaining its position as it has received no changes. Prot Pally is looking kind of nice for its utility as well. And for healers, Disc and Druid are still looking to be the top. High healing capabilities and the strongest buffs and utility kits that have been top tier in M+ for the last 3 or so years, especially now that their DPS counterparts are being nerfed. Resto Shaman's still looking like on live, could definitely slot in if melee classes are viable. And I think Preservoker does escape the other healers on the C tier because it actually does some damage, but I don't think it's enough to overcome the massive downside of not having a raid buff. Now for the dungeons. They brought back Ecodome, Dawnbreaker, Arakara, Priory, and Floodgate for testing this week with only some minor changes. In Ecodome, the first boss now casts 2 sets of dots per phase rather than 3, making the fight easier while also making space conservation easier. If the Devour mechanic is failed though, the boss does have a longer duration buff than before. The second boss sees a small reduction in its damage during its normal phase, and the haste pillars in the last area got a massive buff. It takes about 2 seconds to channel one now, and the buff lasts 30 seconds, which means it's actually usable while going into a pool. In Arakara, they took the bleeds and poisons, which were turbo buffed last week, and made them apply in a way that they get spread out. This avoids a situation where one player got fully targeted with say 4 poisons at a time, but there is still a massive amount of poisons and bleeds, and this change might actually make it harder for groups that do have the dispels. In Priory, they did some nerfs to the Knights and Sharpshooters, as well as buffing their count. Knights went from 18 to 25 count, and Sharpshooters from 5 to 6. Knights are definitely more viable to pull now, and a right side route does get a bit more count from this. And there weren't really any changes for Floodgate, and the same for Dawnbreaker as well, although they did seemingly fix the first boss to target range with the orb again. Also to note, in the Monday patch, they made some crazy changes to Halls of Atonement. The Wicked Bolt casters at the start of Halls used to only target the tank. Now they just target any random player, so you kind of have to kick all of them. It's very lethal, and you need to coordinate kicks and stops very well. And also something weird with these bolts is they also target pets and totems, so pet classes gain a lot of value in this dungeon, and shamans can spam out totems to try and eat the casts. They also massively increased the count required, which was already far more than what was required in Shadowlands. It went from 500 to 575, a 15% increase. If you pull the entire first area, you are only getting about 50% count from it, meaning you have to pull a lot of mobs in the second area, but those mobs are very scary and a melee player can just get one shot at any moment by the Eviscerators. Halls of Atonement was definitely looking like the hardest key in PTR, and it's really weird they buffed it like this. Now they did change one trinket this week. The Mind Fracturing Odium from Delves used to be a proc of 20k haste and about 20% uptime. They nerfed this down to 3700 haste, taking it from an average of 3k haste when accounting for DR to an average of 600 haste, which is hilariously under budget. For reference, a max Sephorium is an average of 2000 crit. And I would like to spotlight a trinket that hasn't been nerfed. The Curstone Idol is a new trinket in Halls of Atonement. It's a minute 30 on use for strength agi users. It is way over budget, giving 50 to 80% more stats than House of Cards at equivalent eye level, and also scaling very hard. They forgot to put this on the PTR vendors, so you can only test it if you farm the drop in Halls of Atonement week. And one cool thing they did this week is they brought out a bank rework where all the bags in your bank, your Regent bank, and your Void storage are all automatically coalesced into 6 large bank tabs the same size as the War Bank. They also made it so that Valor Stones do not reset on season start, which was celebrated until people realized that it's kind of irrelevant because they will no longer be transferable through warbands, and most people will get Valor Stone capped through dungeons and raid before they need to upgrade gear. Now we are 2 weeks from 11.2 release and 3 weeks from the season. It definitely looks like they are done with raid testing, so I probably won't be able to cover much about class tuning with regards to raid. They are picking up the pace with the balance patches, so it is potentially likely for them to release 2 or 3 patches per week until the actual season is released. I am predicting some more nerfs and buffs to come, especially single target related as more and more sims come out. Next week, they will be testing Ecodome and the 3 Shadowlands dungeons, and then after that, they will open up all dungeons for the final week.